So then I thought, okay, he likes it rough. So I put my hand to his throat, and just for a few seconds, because before that he's very strong. He just completely turned around and grabbed me by the throat. He said, now I'm going to show you what I'm going to do to you.
Canada is often pictured as quiet, safe, and untouched by the kinds of horrors that dominate headlines elsewhere. But beneath that calm image lies a darker truth. Over the decades, the country has faced predators whose actions shattered families, haunted communities, and forced the nation to rethink how justice is served. Serial killers aren't just individuals who commit unthinkable acts. They reshape the way people live, the way laws are written, and the way entire societies view safety. In Canada, some of these crimes have left scars that never healed. They've exposed systemic failures, created national outrage, and sparked reforms that still echo today. In today's video, we'll explore the cases that defined Canada's darkest chapters, the ones that left a permanent mark on its history. But before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to subscribe for daily deep dive true crime videos. Robert Pickton, Port Coquitlam, BC, 1980s-2002. In February 2002, police officers descended on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, just outside Vancouver. What began as a routine search quickly spiraled into one of the darkest criminal investigations in Canadian history. Human remains and DNA traces tied to dozens of missing women were discovered across the property. Investigators eventually linked the farm to at least 33 women, though Robert Pickton was convicted of just 6 murders. The revelations were not only about one man's horrific crimes, but also about the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. Robert William Pickton was born in 1949 and raised on his family's pig farm in Port Coquitlam. He inherited the farm, along with his brother, after his parents' deaths, and they turned it into a place that outwardly seemed like a typical agricultural business. Locals described him as a quiet, somewhat eccentric farmer. To many, he appeared unremarkable, someone who lived on the margins of community life. Yet beneath this image of an isolated pig farmer, Pickton cultivated a darker world. The property became known as a place for late-night parties, frequented by bikers and people from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. While it raised eyebrows, no one suspected that it would later be revealed as the center of one of Canada's most infamous criminal cases. Understanding Pickton's crimes requires understanding the context of Vancouver's downtown Eastside. By the 1980s and 1990s, this neighborhood had become one of Canada's most marginalized areas. Poverty, homelessness, drug dependency, and systemic neglect made it a place where people, especially women, were highly vulnerable. Indigenous women and sex workers were particularly at risk. For years, families reported their loved ones missing, but those pleas often met with indifference from authorities. Police frequently dismissed the disappearances as runaways or lifestyle choices rather than potential victims of foul play. Advocates and community members noticed patterns and raised alarms, but their warnings went largely ignored. Between the early 1980s and 2002, dozens of women disappeared from the downtown Eastside. Families and activists organized marches and vigils, desperate for answers. They suspected a predator was targeting vulnerable women, but official investigations remained fragmented and slow. There were warning signs before 2002. In 1997, Pickton was charged with attempted murder after a woman escaped his property and reported being attacked. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, the case was stayed and dropped before trial. This failure to act decisively would later become a major point of criticism during public inquiries. Over the following years, more tips and suspicions surfaced. Police received reports linking Pickton's farm to missing women, but investigative follow-up was limited. Jurisdictional disputes between Vancouver Police and the RCMP also slowed progress. By the late 1990s, the number of missing women had become impossible to ignore, yet it would still take years before the breakthrough came. The turning point came in February 2002. police executed a search warrant on Pickton's property for illegal firearms. While searching, they uncovered something far more disturbing: personal belongings and DNA evidence linked to missing women. This discovery escalated the case into one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. Over the next 2 years, investigators combed through the farm in a massive operation. More than 370,000 cubic yards of soil and debris were sifted, as forensic experts searched for remains and evidence. The investigation cost tens of millions of dollars, becoming Canada's most expensive criminal case at the time. Ultimately, DNA or remains of 33 women were identified on the farm. The scale of the findings horrified Canadians and confirmed what families and advocates from the downtown Eastside had long feared. A predator had been operating unchecked for years, while their pleas for help were overlooked. Pickton was arrested in February 2002. While in custody, police placed him in a cell with an undercover officer posing as another inmate. In this setting, Pickton spoke freely, making chilling admissions. He bragged about targeting women and even suggested that his victim count was higher than what investigators had discovered. These recorded conversations became critical evidence. They revealed not only his lack of remorse, but also his willingness to boast about his actions. For the public, hearing a man who had lived so unremarkably in plain sight casually admit to such crimes was deeply unsettling. Pickton was initially charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder, later increased to 26. However, prosecutors decided to proceed with 6 counts in the first trial, citing the complexity and length of the proceedings. The trial began in 2006 in New Westminster, British Columbia, and lasted almost a year. The evidence presented included forensic findings, DNA analysis, and the undercover recordings. On December 9, 2007, Pickton was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty allowed in Canada at the time. The remaining 20 charges were eventually stayed in 2010, a decision that angered many families of victims. While the court argued that additional trials would not increase his sentence, families felt denied of full justice for their loved ones. Appeals to the Supreme Court of Canada followed, but were dismissed in 2010, upholding both the conviction and sentence. Pickton remains incarcerated to this day. The trial and its aftermath sparked national outrage, not just at the crimes themselves, but at how they were allowed to happen. Families and community advocates pointed to years of ignored complaints and systemic bias. Many argued that the disappearances of Indigenous women and sex workers had not been treated with the urgency they deserved. In response, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry was launched, led by former Judge Wally Oppel. The inquiry, completed in 2012, concluded that both the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP had failed in their duties. It found that systemic bias, poor communication, and institutional indifference contributed to the failure to catch Pickton earlier. The report issued dozens of recommendations, including reforms to how missing persons cases are handled, greater sensitivity toward marginalized communities, and stronger coordination between police forces. For the downtown Eastside community, the Pickton case left permanent scars. Families continue to mourn their loved ones, while annual vigils and memorials honor the women who disappeared. The tragedy also became central to the broader Canadian conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. Advocates argue that the case symbolized decades of systemic neglect. The national inquiry into MMIWG, launched years later, built on the momentum and outrage sparked by Pickton's crimes. It highlighted how colonialism, racism, and discrimination continue to place Indigenous women at disproportionate risk. The story of Robert Pickton is not only about one man's actions, but about an entire system's failure to protect its most vulnerable. It revealed how marginalized voices were dismissed, how institutions failed to connect clear warning signs, and how families were left to fight for answers on their own. While Pickton will never be released, the tragedy forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, discrimination, and the responsibility of justice systems. The scars remain, but so does the determination of communities to ensure that the women lost are never forgotten. Bruce McArthur, Toronto, Ontario, 2010 to 2017.
So then I thought, okay, he likes it rough. So I put my hand to his throat, and just for a few seconds, because before that he's very strong, he just completely turned around and grabbed me by the throat. He said, now I'm going to show you what I'm going to do to you.
In January 2018, Toronto police searching the home of a self-employed landscaper made a chilling discovery. Human remains were hidden inside large planters at properties where he worked. The man behind them was Bruce McArthur, a trusted gardener who had quietly been targeting men connected to Toronto's gay village for years. His arrest ended one of Canada's most disturbing serial murder cases, but it also opened a deeper conversation about policing, systemic bias, and how vulnerable voices in marginalized communities are too often ignored. Bruce McArthur was born in 1951 and grew up in rural Ontario. He eventually moved to Toronto, where he lived a modest life. After working in retail, he built a landscaping business, gaining steady clients in upscale neighborhoods. Those who hired him described him as reliable, polite, and even friendly. He often appeared with a smile, tending gardens and caring for properties, giving no outward indication of the secrets he was hiding. McArthur also had connections to Toronto's Church Wellesley neighborhood, often called the Gay Village. The community was a hub for LGBTQ+ life in Canada's largest city, a place of both celebration and resilience after decades of struggle for visibility and rights. But while the village represented safety for many, it also contained vulnerabilities, especially for racialized men, immigrants, and those without strong support systems. It was within this trusted community, in the shadow of acceptance, that McArthur began preying on men. Starting in 2010, men connected to the gay village began to disappear. One of the first was Skandaraj Navaratnam, a Sri Lankan immigrant who was last seen leaving a bar with someone friends later identified as McArthur. In the following years, more names were added: Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, and others. Families reported their loved ones missing, but progress in the investigations was slow. By 2012, community members had begun connecting the dots. Posters appeared across the village, vigils were organized, and concerns were raised that a predator might be targeting vulnerable men. Yet official investigations often stalled. Police launched Project Houston in 2012 to examine several cases, but shut it down in 2014, saying there wasn't enough evidence to suggest foul play. Meanwhile, disappearances continued. By 2017, when Selim Eason and Andrew Kinsman went missing just months apart, frustration boiled over. Community members protested, demanding more attention and transparency. Many in the LGBTQ+ community, particularly racialized members, felt their concerns were not being taken seriously. The gay village had a long history of mistrust with police, dating back to raids in the 1980s that targeted gay spaces. By the 2010s, relations had improved on the surface, but McArthur's case reopened old wounds. Activists argued that if the missing men had been from more privileged backgrounds, investigations would have been faster and more thorough. Families of victims described difficulties communicating with police, while community advocates insisted the pattern was obvious. For many, each new disappearance deepened the fear that authorities were failing to act with urgency. This growing tension came to a breaking point in 2017. The disappearance of Andrew Kinsman, a well-known village resident, finally shifted the police response. As police dug deeper, suspicions about McArthur grew. They obtained warrants to monitor him, concerned that he might strike again. Their fears were confirmed when they discovered a man tied up but alive in McArthur's Toronto apartment in January 2018. Acting quickly, they arrested him, preventing what investigators later said could have been another murder. Searches of properties where McArthur had worked uncovered human remains hidden in large planters. Over weeks of forensic work, police identified 8 victims: Navaratnam, Faizi, Kaihan, Ihsan, Kinsman, Soroush Mahmoudi, Dean Lisowick, and Karushna Kanagaratnam. The methodical concealment of their remains shocked the city and confirmed what families and activists had long feared. Bruce McArthur's arrest on January 18, 2018, marked the end of his killing spree, but the beginning of widespread anger. During interrogation, McArthur offered little resistance, and evidence quickly mounted. Unlike many high-profile suspects who deny involvement, McArthur faced overwhelming forensic proof, from DNA to recovered belongings. The calmness with which he had blended into daily life, working as a gardener by day while targeting men at night, unsettled both investigators and the public. For Toronto's LGBTQ+ community, his arrest confirmed that a predator had been hiding in plain sight, enabled in part by systemic gaps in how missing persons cases were handled. In January 2019, just a year after his arrest, Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. His decision spared families the pain of a lengthy trial, though many described the proceedings as emotionally devastating nonetheless. On February 8, 2019, McArthur was sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. The judge noted the deliberate, calculated nature of his crimes and the cruelty in how he concealed them. Given McArthur's age, 67 at sentencing, parole eligibility in 2044 would effectively mean he would never walk free. Families of victims delivered impact statements in court, describing not only their grief, but also their frustration at how long it had taken for authorities to act. For many, justice felt partial. McArthur was punished, but the systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked still needed addressing. Public outrage over the case prompted a comprehensive review of how Toronto police handled missing persons cases. In 2019, the City of Toronto commissioned an independent review led by former Judge Gloria Epstein. The resulting Missing and Missed report, released in 2021, was damning. It found systemic discrimination, inadequate communication with families, and a lack of urgency in investigating the disappearances of marginalized people. The report concluded that community concerns had been repeatedly dismissed and that opportunities to catch McArthur earlier were missed. Among its 151 recommendations were calls for better training on cultural competency, stronger ties with marginalized communities, and significant reforms in how missing persons cases are investigated. The report emphasized that trust could only be rebuilt through accountability and change. The Bruce McArthur case left deep scars on Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. Annual vigils and memorials now honor the 8 men, ensuring their names and lives are remembered beyond the horror of their deaths. Community organizations continue to push for reforms, not only in policing, but also in how society protects its most vulnerable. The case also became symbolic of a broader issue: how systemic bias can cost lives. Many advocates argue that if early warnings had been taken more seriously, several of McArthur's victims might still be alive. The tragedy reinforced the need for institutions to listen to marginalized voices, whether in Toronto's gay village or in communities across Canada. For criminologists and law enforcement, McArthur's arrest is studied as a case of both investigative breakthroughs and profound systemic failures. It serves as a reminder that justice is not only about catching a killer, but about ensuring all communities are equally protected. The story of Bruce McArthur is not just about one man's crimes. It is about the silence that allowed him to continue, the warnings that went unheard, and the families who fought for answers when institutions failed them. His conviction closed a chapter of fear for Toronto's LGBTQ+ community, but it also opened a lasting conversation about equality, accountability, and trust. Clifford Olson, British Columbia, 1980 to 1981. In August 1981, Canadians were confronted with a nightmare. Clifford Olson, a man already known to police as a career criminal, was arrested and confessed to murdering 11 children and teenagers across British Columbia's Lower Mainland. But what horrified the public even more was what followed. Olson refused to disclose the locations of his victims unless the government paid money to his family. When authorities agreed to the cash for bodies deal, outrage erupted nationwide. This was not just a story of horrific crimes. It became a symbol of justice manipulated and of institutions caught in a moral crisis. Clifford Robert Olson, Jr. was born in 1940 in Vancouver, British Columbia, and grew up in nearby Richmond. From a young age, he was known more for trouble than achievement. Neighbors and teachers described him as disruptive and dishonest. By his teenage years, Olson had turned to theft, fraud, and cons. As an adult, his life was a revolving door of petty crimes, prison sentences, and manipulations. Inmates later recalled how Olson boasted about tricking both fellow prisoners and the justice system. He thrived on deception, often bragging that he could outsmart anyone who crossed his path. By the late 1970s, he had built a reputation not as a violent offender, but as a manipulative career criminal. That image would change abruptly in 1980, when the lower mainland of British Columbia was shaken by a sudden wave of disappearances involving children and teenagers. Between November 1980 and July 1981, 11 young people vanished in communities across the lower mainland. The victims, boys and girls aged 9 to 18, were last seen walking home, heading to friends' houses, or traveling locally. Families immediately raised alarms, but in many cases, authorities initially suspected the youths had run away. At the time, police resources for missing children were limited, and the assumption that teenagers might have left voluntarily delayed full investigations. As the months went on, fear spread through communities like Surrey, Burnaby, Coquitlam, and Maple Ridge. Parents began warning children not to walk alone, and neighborhoods organized informal patrols. Yet the disappearances continued, leaving families desperate for answers. Behind the scenes, Olson was exploiting these vulnerabilities. He preyed on young people who trusted the promise of a ride or a friendly conversation. By the summer of 1981, the scope of the crisis was undeniable. The lower mainland was under siege by a predator whose reach seemed to grow with each passing month. The turning point came in August 1981. Police had placed Clifford Olson under surveillance after noticing his presence near areas where children had gone missing. His criminal record, constant travel, and suspicious behavior drew increasing attention. On August 12, 1981, Olson was arrested in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island in connection with the disappearance of a young boy. Investigators suspected they finally had their man, but what Olson revealed next would shock even seasoned officers. While in custody, Olson admitted to killing multiple victims. But there was a catch. He would only provide details about the murders and the locations of the bodies if the government agreed to pay his family. In a move that remains one of the most controversial in Canadian legal history, the RCMP and federal government agreed to Olson's demand. The arrangement provided $10,000 for each victim's body he revealed, with a total of $100,000 paid to his wife on behalf of their young son. Under this deal, Olson led police to sites across British Columbia, where the remains of his victims were recovered. The process brought devastating closure to families who had been searching for months, but it came at a moral cost. The idea that a killer could profit, even indirectly, from his crimes outraged Canadians. Headlines across the country condemned the arrangement as a betrayal of justice. Families were torn between relief at finally knowing the fate of their loved ones and disgust that Olson had manipulated the system so brazenly. The cash for bodies deal became the defining feature of Olson's case, overshadowing even the crimes themselves. It left scars not only on the victims' families, but on Canada's faith in its justice system. Despite the controversy, the evidence against Olson was overwhelming. In January 1982, he pleaded guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder. His plea meant that families were spared a long and painful trial, but it also denied the public a full airing of the details. The judge sentenced Olson to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty available in Canada at the time. Court observers noted Olson's lack of remorse, describing him as smug and detached during proceedings. Even behind bars, Olson continued to manipulate the system. He wrote letters to journalists, offered to sell tell-all stories, and later pursued parole applications that forced victims' families to relive their trauma. From the moment of his conviction, Clifford Olson became one of Canada's most hated criminals. The outrage was not only about the killings, but about the perception that he had manipulated both the justice system and the grieving families. In 1997, Olson became eligible for parole. His application was immediately denied, but the very process of his hearings reopened wounds for the families. Each time he applied, relatives had to prepare statements and attend hearings, forced to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. In 2010, just a year before his death from cancer, Olson again applied for parole. His request was rejected within minutes, but the spectacle reaffirmed the need for reforms to limit repeated applications by dangerous offenders. Olson's case left a profound legacy in Canada. The cash for bodies deal sparked intense debate about the ethics of bargaining with killers. Authorities vowed never again to permit financial incentives in exchange for confessions or evidence. His repeated parole applications fueled legislative changes. Families and advocates pushed for victims' rights reforms, including limits on how often offenders could reapply for parole and greater support for families navigating the process. The case also changed how missing children's cases were treated. Police forces across Canada strengthened their missing persons units, placing greater emphasis on rapid response and interagency cooperation. The assumption that children had simply run away gave way to more urgent, structured investigations. For the families of the 11 young victims, however, reforms could not erase the pain. Annual vigils and memorials across British Columbia continue to honor the lives lost. Olson's name remains synonymous with both cruelty and corruption of justice. While Olson himself is gone, the outrage he provoked reshaped parole laws, victims' rights, and how missing persons cases are handled. His case remains a chilling reminder that justice must not only punish crime, but also uphold integrity, fairness, and respect for victims above all else. In 1993, Canadians were stunned when a seemingly picture-perfect couple was revealed to be two of the country's most notorious killers. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka looked like they belonged in a magazine, young, attractive, suburban, and outwardly ordinary. But behind closed doors, they concealed a violent partnership that escalated from hidden assaults to the murders of two teenage girls. They would be remembered forever as the Ken and Barbie Killers. This case was not only about the cruelty of their crimes, but also about how the justice system handled them, sparking outrage that still lingers today. Paul Bernardo was born in 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario. Outwardly, he came across as charming and ambitious, someone who blended easily into middle-class life. But throughout the late 1980s, he was secretly living a double life. A wave of assaults terrorized the Scarborough area, and although investigators pursued leads, the perpetrator, later identified as Bernardo, remained at large for years. The attacks earned him the moniker the Scarborough R-word, though at the time, police had not yet connected the crimes to him. Karla Homolka, born in 1970, appeared to embody the role of a typical young woman from a stable, middle-class family in St. Catharines, Ontario. When she met Bernardo in 1987, their relationship was intense and fast-moving. To family and friends, they seemed inseparable, even enviable. Yet behind the facade of a loving couple, Homolka became both accomplice and participant in Bernardo's escalating violence. The first victim to emerge in their combined crimes was shockingly close to home. In December 1990, Karla's younger sister, Tammy Homolka, died at just 15 years old. The death was initially ruled accidental, with suspicions pointing to complications after she had consumed alcohol. For the Homolka family, it was a devastating personal tragedy. But when investigators later uncovered the truth, the betrayal shocked the nation. Karla and Paul had been directly involved in Tammy's death, a fact revealed only years later during Karla's testimony. The idea that Karla could help facilitate harm against her own sister shattered public perceptions of her as a passive partner. It became the first sign that their partnership was darker and more complicit than many had initially believed. After Tammy's death, Bernardo and Homolka's violence escalated. On June 14, 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey disappeared from Burlington, Ontario, after being locked out of her house late at night. Her disappearance immediately alarmed her family and friends. Days later, her body was discovered, confirming fears that she had been taken and killed. Less than a year later, on April 16, 1992, another teenager, Kristen French, was abducted in St. Catharines. She was walking home from school on a bright spring afternoon when she vanished. Her case drew intense media coverage and community fear as families across Ontario recognized that a predator was operating in their midst. Kristen's body was later discovered, and investigators began connecting the two cases. The pattern was now undeniable. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a disturbing escalation of violence carried out by Bernardo and Homolka together. As investigators closed in, the most critical piece of evidence emerged: videotapes hidden by Bernardo that documented the couple's involvement in the crimes. These recordings revealed the extent of Karla's participation, contradicting the narrative she initially gave to police. Before the tapes were discovered, Karla had already entered into a plea deal in May 1993. She agreed to testify against Bernardo in exchange for a 12-year sentence for manslaughter. Prosecutors at the time did not yet have access to the tapes, which would later show her as an active participant, not just a coerced accomplice. When the tapes were finally turned over by Bernardo's lawyers, the public reaction was explosive. Outrage swept across the country as people realized Karla had secured what many considered a lenient sentence despite her direct involvement. The term "deal with the devil" became attached to her plea bargain, and debates about prosecutorial decisions dominated Canadian media for years. Paul Bernardo's arrest came in February 1993, after years of suspicion and mounting evidence. By this time, DNA testing had advanced, and samples previously collected linked him to the Scarborough assaults. Police had also gathered significant evidence tying him to the disappearances of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. During interrogation, Bernardo denied involvement, but the discovery of the videotapes left little room for doubt. The recordings became a cornerstone of the case, providing irrefutable proof of his actions and Karla's complicity. For investigators and the public alike, it was one of the most disturbing revelations in Canadian legal history. Bernardo's trial began in May 1995 in Toronto and lasted several months. He faced charges of first-degree murder in the deaths of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey, as well as charges related to the Scarborough assaults. The prosecution's case combined DNA evidence, the videotapes, and Karla's testimony under her plea deal. In September 1995, Bernardo was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of forcible confinement, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and 1 count of sow, omitting an indignity to a body. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, later declared a dangerous offender, ensuring he would remain incarcerated indefinitely. Karla, meanwhile, served her 12-year sentence and was released in 2005. Her release reignited public anger, with many questioning whether justice had truly been served given the evidence of her active role. The handling of the Bernardo and Homolka case left a lasting scar on Canada's justice system. The controversy over Karla's plea deal sparked nationwide debate about prosecutorial discretion, evidence disclosure, and transparency in plea bargaining. Many argued that the deal should never have been offered without a complete understanding of her involvement. For families of the victims, the outcome was painful. While Bernardo would never walk free, Karla's release felt like a profound injustice. Public opinion polls throughout the 1990s and 2000s consistently showed outrage at her sentence. The case became a touchstone in Canadian discussions about fairness, accountability, and how to balance the need for testimony with the demand for justice. The crimes of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka remain etched in Canadian memory as one of the most disturbing cases of the 20th century. They exposed not only the cruelty of two individuals, but also the vulnerabilities of the justice system. For law enforcement, the case underscored the importance of timely DNA testing. In the Scarborough assaults, Bernardo could have been identified earlier if testing backlogs had not delayed results, potentially preventing later crimes. For prosecutors, the controversy around Homolka's plea deal emphasized the need for caution and transparency in making agreements, especially before all evidence is reviewed. The story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka is not just about violence, but about trust betrayed by a partner, by a system, and by appearances. It is a case that forced Canadians to reckon with uncomfortable truths about justice, accountability, and the hidden dangers behind ordinary faces. Elizabeth Wettlaufer, Southwestern Ontario, 2007 to 2016. In September 2016, a nurse walked into a Toronto police station and calmly confessed to killing 8 elderly patients under her care. Her weapon wasn't a gun or a knife, it was insulin, a drug meant to save lives. Investigators were stunned. Cases like hers are rare anywhere in the world, and in Canada, she would become the country's first known healthcare serial killer. What followed was not only the story of her crimes, but also a reckoning with how an entire system failed to protect some of its most vulnerable citizens. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was born in 1967 and grew up in Woodstock, Ontario, a small community in southwestern Ontario. Raised in a religious household, she eventually trained to become a registered nurse, graduating in the early 1990s. On paper, she was well qualified, licensed, and part of a trusted profession that families relied on to care for their loved ones. But behind her professional image, Wettlaufer struggled with personal challenges. She battled mental health issues, including depression, and later admitted to substance use problems. Colleagues sometimes noticed erratic behavior, but in a busy and often understaffed long-term care environment, those concerns didn't always trigger formal review. By the mid-2000s, Wettlaufer was employed at Carasant Care Nursing Home in Woodstock. To residents and their families, she appeared to be another face in a system where staff turnover was high. Few could have imagined that she would eventually confess to using her access to patients and medications to carry out deliberate harm. Long-term care facilities are built on trust. Families often make painful decisions to place loved ones in nursing homes, believing trained staff will provide the dignity, safety, and compassion they deserve. In Canada, the system has faced chronic pressures, aging, populations, staffing shortages, and limited resources. Yet the expectation has always been that medical professionals would uphold their duty of care. Wettlaufer exploited this trust. Her victims were elderly residents, many with complex health needs. Their frailty and medical conditions made them particularly vulnerable, and any sudden decline was often attributed to natural causes. Because mortality rates are higher in such facilities, unusual patterns can easily be overlooked without rigorous monitoring. The fact that a nurse, someone sworn to protect, could turn that role into a weapon was almost unthinkable for families. It wasn't until Wettlaufer herself confessed years later that the pattern came into focus. Wettlaufer began her killings in 2007. While working at Carasant Care, she administered excessive doses of insulin to residents. Insulin, when misused, can cause rapid decline, but because many patients were already diabetic, its presence didn't immediately raise suspicion. Between 2007 and 2014, she killed 7 patients at Carasant Care and attempted to harm others. She later admitted that she selected victims based not on who they were, but on her own impulses. Her confessions revealed that she felt urges she couldn't control, though she never provided a clear rationale. In 2014, after ongoing performance issues and conflicts with colleagues, she left Carasant Care. She then found work at Meadow Park Long-Term Care in London, Ontario, where she killed another patient in 2014. Later, while working in community nursing, she attempted to harm additional individuals in their homes. For nearly a decade, Wettlaufer operated without detection. Families mourned what they believed were natural losses, never imagining their loved ones had been deliberately targeted. The pattern went unnoticed until Wettlaufer herself decided to reveal it. In September 2016, Wettlaufer reached a breaking point. Struggling emotionally, she told a counselor about her actions. The counselor urged her to speak with authorities, and she voluntarily went to Toronto police. There, she calmly explained that she had killed 8 patients and attempted to harm several others by administering insulin overdoses. Investigators were initially skeptical. False confessions are not unheard of, but as she provided details about victims, timelines, and facilities, her story aligned with medical records. Police quickly launched a sweeping investigation across multiple nursing homes and community care sites where she had worked. Families were contacted, and what had once been unexplained or accepted as natural deaths suddenly became evidence of a serial pattern. Her confession was shocking, not just for its content, but for its delivery. Officers later described her as detached, even relieved, to share what she had done. Without her coming forward, many believe her crimes might never have been discovered. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was arrested in October 2016 and charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Her trial moved relatively quickly. In June 2017, she pleaded guilty to all charges. Families of victims filled the courtroom, delivering emotional impact statements that described their grief and betrayal. The judge acknowledged the extraordinary harm not only to individuals, but to the healthcare system as a whole. On June 26, 2017, Wettlaufer was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum under Canadian law. She was also barred from ever practicing nursing again. The case closed swiftly, but the larger questions it raised were only beginning. Public reaction to Wettlaufer's confession and conviction was immediate and intense. How could a nurse have killed so many patients over nearly a decade without being stopped? In response, Ontario launched the public inquiry into the safety and security of residents in the long-term care home system, led by Justice Eileen Gillies. The inquiry examined how Wettlaufer's crimes went undetected and what could be done to prevent such tragedies in the future. The final report, released in July 2019, was sobering. It found systemic weaknesses across the long-term care system. Inadequate monitoring of medication use, poor communication between facilities and regulators, a lack of reporting mechanisms for staff concerns, insufficient training on recognizing suspicious patterns in patient deaths. The inquiry issued 91 recommendations, including tighter controls on high-risk medications, stronger whistleblower protections for staff, increased funding for inspections, and more resources for mental health support among healthcare workers. Justice Gillies emphasized that the case was a systemic failure, not just an individual one. While Wettlaufer alone committed the crimes, the environment allowed her to act unchecked. For families of victims, the inquiry was both validating. For the public, the case shattered confidence in nursing homes. Across Canada, families began questioning the safety of long-term care and demanding greater oversight. Advocacy groups for seniors and healthcare accountability gained momentum, pressing for reforms well beyond Ontario. The tragedy also highlighted broader issues of aging populations and underfunded elder care. It forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths that vulnerable seniors, often voiceless, are at risk when oversight fails. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was the first known healthcare serial killer in Canada. Cases of medical professionals deliberately harming patients are rare worldwide, but when they occur, they shake public trust profoundly. Unlike serial predators who operate in the shadows, Wettlaufer used the authority of her role. She had unrestricted access to patients and the tools of medicine, and the very qualities that made her trusted, her training, her position, became her means of committing crimes. Since the inquiry, Ontario has pledged to implement the majority of the recommendations. Steps have included stricter protocols around insulin and other high-risk medications, mandatory reporting of suspicious incidents, and more frequent inspections of care homes. Nationally, the case added urgency to ongoing discussions about the state of long-term care, especially as Canada's population ages. Advocacy for stronger protections, better staffing ratios, and improved training continues. For families, memorials and vigils have honored the 8 lives lost. Their advocacy ensured that the tragedy was not buried in statistics, but remained a call for reform. Russell Williams, Ottawa, CFB, Trenton, Ontario, 2009 to 2010. In February 2010, Canadians watched in disbelief as a decorated colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force, a man entrusted with commanding one of the country's most important military bases, was led into court in shackles. Russell Williams was a symbol of discipline and authority, someone who attended ceremonies, greeted political leaders, and stood as a representative of the Canadian forces. But behind the uniform, Williams had lived a double life. He had spent years breaking into homes, stealing intimate clothing, escalating to violent assaults, and ultimately committing 2 murders. His arrest marked one of the most shocking betrayals of trust in Canadian history. Russell Williams was born in 1963 in Bromsgrove, England, before his family emigrated to Canada. He grew up in Ontario, later attending the University of Toronto, where he studied economics and political science. In 1987, he joined the Canadian Forces and quickly distinguished himself. Williams trained as a pilot, flew military aircraft, and steadily advanced through the ranks. By 2009, his career had peaked. He was promoted to colonel and placed in command of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, located near Belleville, Ontario. CFB Trenton was a hub of military operations, coordinating overseas missions, humanitarian flights, and the repatriation of fallen soldiers. Williams appeared frequently in media, often photographed in full uniform, his medals visible, standing beside dignitaries. To outsiders, he seemed the model officer, competent, disciplined, and dedicated. That image made the revelations of 2010 all the more devastating. While his public career soared, Williams cultivated secret obsessions. Beginning around 2007, he began breaking into homes in Ottawa and Tweed, Ontario. His targets were women's bedrooms. He stole intimate clothing, his break-ins, and meticulously cataloged the items he took. Over time, his actions escalated. By September 2009, Williams committed his first known violent assaults. 2 women in Tweed were attacked in their homes by an intruder who tied them up and assaulted them. Both survived, but the crimes left the small community deeply shaken. Police circulated warnings, but the identity of the attacker remained unknown. This hidden world stood in stark contrast to his polished image as a colonel. Williams attended military ceremonies during the day, then at night prowled neighborhoods, slipping into homes, and documenting his crimes with photographs. The escalation continued. On November 25, 2009, Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a 37-year-old military flight attendant stationed at CFB Trenton, was killed in her home near Brighton, Ontario. Comeau had worked with Williams and was respected within the Air Force. Her death shocked her colleagues and raised concerns about the safety of military personnel. Just 2 months later, on January 28, 2010, Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman from Belleville, was reported missing after failing to show up for work. Her disappearance triggered a large search effort and drew immediate attention from local residents. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone was targeting women in the region around CFB Trenton. Investigators from the Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, launched a major operation. They discovered tire tracks in the snow outside Jessica Lloyd's home, a crucial clue. On February 4, 2010, officers conducted a roadside canvass, stopping vehicles to compare tire treads. Williams drove a Nissan Pathfinder, and investigators quickly noticed that the tires appeared to match the tracks. Within days, police summoned him for questioning. On February 7, 2010, Russell Williams voluntarily came to OPP headquarters in Ottawa. Detective Jim Smythe, a skilled interrogator, conducted the session. Initially, Williams appeared calm and confident, answering questions politely. But Smith methodically presented the evidence, the tire tracks, DNA samples, and inconsistencies in his statements. As the pressure mounted, Williams's composed facade began to crack. By the end of the session, he confessed to multiple crimes, including the murders of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd, as well as the assaults and numerous break-ins. The interrogation, later released to the public, became infamous for its slow unraveling of a man who had spent years hiding behind authority. In October 2010, Williams appeared in court in Belleville and pleaded guilty to 88 charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of assault, forcible confinement, and 82 break-ins and thefts. Over 4 days of sentencing hearings, the court heard detailed evidence and victim impact statements. Families and survivors described the lasting trauma and the devastation of losing loved ones. Williams listened quietly, showing little outward emotion. On October 21, 2010, he was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty under Canadian law. Given the severity of the crimes and his confession, he was also designated a dangerous offender, ensuring he would remain behind bars indefinitely. The Canadian forces moved swiftly to sever ties with Williams. In January 2011, he was officially stripped of his rank, medals, and honors. His uniform was destroyed, and his name was removed from military records. For the Canadian military, the scandal was unprecedented. A senior officer entrusted with command had been revealed as a serial predator. The betrayal was not only of the victims and their families, but also of the public trust in the institution. Reforms in oversight and internal accountability followed, with increased attention to how officers are monitored and assessed. The case gripped Canada. Media coverage was intense, not just because of the crimes, but because of the stark contrast between Williams' role as a respected colonel and his secret life as a predator. Communities in Tweed, Belleville, and across Ontario were left traumatized. Memorials were held for Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd, honoring their lives and offering spaces for collective grief. Survivors of Williams' assaults spoke publicly about their resilience, ensuring their voices were heard in the narrative. For the broader public, the case forced uncomfortable questions. How could someone so trusted and highly placed commit such crimes unnoticed? And how could institutions rebuild trust after such a betrayal? Russell Williams' crimes left a permanent scar on Canada's military and justice system. His case is now studied in criminology and law enforcement training, particularly the interrogation that led to his confession. It is seen as both a success in investigative technique and a cautionary tale about authority figures who mask dangerous behavior. The military has continued to emphasize transparency, leadership accountability, and mental health awareness among officers. The case also became symbolic of a broader truth, that trust placed in individuals and institutions must always be paired with oversight, vigilance, and accountability. Russell Williams' story is not just about the crimes he committed, but about the profound betrayal of trust. As a colonel, he represented discipline, authority, and service to country. In reality, he lived a double life that devastated families and scarred institutions. His conviction ensured justice, but the damage to public confidence in the Canadian forces endures. The case remains one of Canada's darkest reminders that authority does not equal integrity, and that vigilance is essential in protecting communities from even the most unexpected threats. Across decades, these cases carved deep scars into Canada's history. From suburban Ontario to the streets of Vancouver, from long-term care homes to military bases, each story revealed not just the horror of individual crimes, but the cracks in the systems meant to keep people safe. These killers were not just ordinary criminals. Many hid in plain sight, cloaked in trust, authority, or the appearance of normality. Their actions forced Canada to confront difficult truths, that marginalized voices were too often ignored, that oversight could fail, and that institutions, whether police, healthcare, or the military, are not infallible. The public's reaction was a mix of grief, outrage, and determination. Authorities were pushed to change how missing persons are handled, how parole and oversight systems function, and how institutions are held accountable. These legacies remain with us today, reminders that justice must always be vigilant. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these cases shocked you the most, and what lessons do you think Canada still needs to learn? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for daily deep dive true crime documentaries.